Welcome to the fourth lecture in the series Feminism in the Digital Age, Transnational Activism in Germany and Beyond. Thank you to my co-speakers in this series and to the Arts Resource Center for providing their technological expertise throughout this series. Thank you also to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for their support of the project Technologies of Popfeminist Activism, out of which this lecture series stems. My talk today is the second in a series on awkward activism, which my collaborator on this project, Maria Stehle, began in Lecture 3. Maria laid the theoretical and methodological foundations of our use of the term awkward to describe political moments in contemporary feminist digital activism. I will revisit some of that groundwork in initial comments at the outset of this talk before turning to the aesthetics of just such activism and the implications for building a feminist ethos. In so doing, I hope to further elaborate on awkwardness by linking to the previous lectures in this series and to open up larger questions around the form and impact of feminist activism in and beyond the digital age, questions which may be pursued in the December 8th roundtable. In her lecture, Maria outlined how in our project we rethink not only the way feminist performance, protest, and activism work in the digital age, and how they in turn rewrite the digital economy, but also how contemporary feminism as an aesthetic ethos must be rethought for the 21st century. As Maria showed, but also as was implied in both Hester's and Christina's lectures, feminist actions, both in Germany and transnationally, are often held up to a yardstick of success or failure. This is most recently illustrated in Time magazine's decision to put feminism on its list of words that should be banned in 2015, alongside such greats as I can't even, nom nom, and kale. They later apologized and removed it from the list, claiming they wished to, quote, invite debate about how the word was used this year, but that the, quote, nuance was lost. Other examples for this struggle with feminist evaluations are found across a wide range of media and formats, stretching from popular culture to activist communities, and are found in multiple cultural contexts. For example, pop superstar Lady Gaga has sparked such headlines as, "Is Lady Gaga a feminist or isn't she?" or "Is Lady Gaga a feminist?" discussion. The discourse here matching with what Christina spoke of as the repudiation of feminism in post-feminism. Here, feminism as shameful, outdated, or unseemingly, despite Lady Gaga's continued status as a queer icon. Of course, not only superstars receive such evaluative treatment. The continually resurging debates around motherhood in the Western world are also about the political validity of feminism today. The public response to Time magazine's May 2012 sexploitative cover story on attachment parenting entitled "Are You Mom Enough?" or the April 2012 release of the English translation of popular academic Elizabeth Badinger's book, The Conflict: How Modern Motherhood Undermines the Status of Women, have, at their core, the question of feminist effectivity. Moreover, new media and social networks allow for the immediate transmission of such discourses across national cultural borders. For example, the July-August 2012 Atlantic article by Anne-Marie Slaughter, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, written for the U.S. context, was almost immediately answered in an August 2012 Spiegel article by Claudia Voigt, Frauen können alles haben, women can have it all. That this latter article is obviously written for the German context is apparent in the subtitle placed below the digital fold, Sie sollten nur viel früher Kinder bekommen. They should only have children much earlier in life, which makes a clear reference to the demography debate that had dominated much of the family political discourse since 2000, mentioned in Christina's and Hester's lectures respectively, as a turning point in German feminist discourse. However, not only mainstream popular media perpetuates the drive to evaluate feminist effectivity. Feminist media as well engages in this evaluation. We can see this most urgently in the conflicted response by feminists to the Ukrainian sextremist group Femen, discussed at length in Hester's case study. Following the revelation in the film Ukraine is Not a Brothel that the group was founded by a man, bitch media directly questioned Femen's core principles, and one blogger wrote on the Feminist Wire, quote, "There is a wrong way to do feminism, and Femen is doing it wrong." More, such international digital campaigns as the Tumblr I Am a Feminist Because, which invites women and men to post images of themselves holding signs that explain their reasons for feminism, spark in form reactionary backlash, as seen in the use of this format by the German neoconservative party Junge Alternative für Deutschland, Young Alternative for Germany, to protest the institution of a women's quota. Other responses to I Am a Feminist Because are more tongue-in-cheek, but no less questioning in its effectivity, as seen in this cat Tumblr. By explicitly utilizing the form of a feminist digital action, such responses attempt to undermine and question the utility of feminist protests today. Such pop-culturally specific additions to feminist evaluation in the form of popular icons, the mommy wars, extremist activism, and social media platforms highlight the globality of the debate around feminist effectivity. The consistent drive to evaluate the effectiveness of feminist work, creative, activist, or academic, the circularity of the representation-reception process, and the ambiguity and necessity of the feminist political have become ever more visible in the marked rise of the digital transnational reach of local political activism discussed already in the previous lectures, including also feminist activism, slutwalks, Femen, Pussy Riot, #Aufschrei. In all of these examples, there is an expectation of success or failure of the feminist cause. Our effective reaction against the expectation that we as feminist scholars should pass political judgment on such activism, which we term pop-feminist, turned into our attempt to ask not if, but how such protests work politically. Our assumption, of course, is feminist to begin with. That we do not live in a world where feminist activism is not needed anymore and where all is well. On the contrary, examples of feminist protest and, equally importantly, the questions and reactions generated by them, point to the fact that gender remains a key category in political power play. Awkwardness allows us to address precisely the stickiness of the political in this discussion. Avoiding the failure-success binary that is characteristic of neoliberal structures in a cruel optimistic society, following our reading of Lauren Berlant discussed at length by Maria in Lecture 3, we explore the urgency of feminist politics today by identifying and working within a circularity in feminist creative work and activism that we describe as awkward. Such circulations, we argue, are awkward in that they are enabled by a neoliberal digital economy, but simultaneously reveal the false promises of neoliberal capitalism by mobilizing, uncovering, not detaching from, attempting to detach from these. This was clearly apparent in Maria's discussion of Chicks on Speed and Lady Bitch Ray. Awkwardness also describes the aesthetic of such politics as one of becoming, of process, of defiance, and of disruption. In this sense, our readings of feminist protest events in the digital age suggest that keeping with the awkward is a mode of politics that offers up an ethos for feminist engagement. These awkward aesthetics could also be called adolescent for a number of reasons. Think of the euphemism, the awkward age. Adolescence evokes gangly bodies, hormones out of whack, libidinal or other urges colliding with familial prohibition, the sense of sticking out while using every means necessary to conform, and the willingness to assert opinions while these are still forming. If we describe the aesthetics of feminist activism in a digital age as adolescent, the invocation should not be one of teenage upstarts or immature actions, but instead of becomings, processes, and thresholds that are intimately joined with the body and with negotiating the body within its broader context. It is this notion of process that is essential to the circularity of the awkward moment. The political meaning is not found in a fixed result of the action, failure, or success, but rather in the unfolding, turning back, and circulation of the intended and unintended relations and results. Understood in this manner as adolescent, aesthetics bring out the temporal reach, perpetually in the now, and the connections and relations, affect, both of these dimensions directly linked to medium and materiality, or technologies of feminist activism. Technology, as Maria noted in her lecture, seen as both digital and corporeal. I would like to briefly turn to each of these non-discrete dimensions to the aesthetics of awkward activism, particularly for how they suggest circularity and circulations, process, and development. Further, I will explore the political implications, particularly for understanding the transnational aesthetic of German activism. Let's begin with thinking about aesthetics as a way to access the present, or the perpetual now of this activism. To return to one of our theoretical underpinnings, in Cruel Optimism, Lauren Berlant engages with the development of what she calls genres that describe, quote, the activity of being reflexive about a contemporary historicity as one lives it, and that, quote, track the sense of the present. Thinking in terms of our topic for this lecture series, genre might be one way of talking about the narrative of contemporary German feminism being developed through these digital actions. This narrative is positioned both with, as part of, and against other narratives of the present, such as mainstream post-feminism, historical lineages of second and third wave feminism, and neoliberalism, these narratives outlined in the previous lectures. Out of these new genres, Berlant argues further, come an emergent aesthetics that speak, quote, to the new social movements that have organized under the rubrics of precarity and the precarious. She writes of the term aesthetic that it provides metrics for understanding how we pace and space our encounters with things, how we manage the too closeness of the world, and also the desire to have an impact on it that has some relation to its impact on us, end quote. Emergent aesthetics, therefore, describe how we make sense of the experience of the world in terms of the narrative being developed here about contemporary feminisms, and how we measured what impact our emotional and sensorial engagement with the material or things of that experience has on our immediate development of self. Narrative and impact are process-based, that is, in a state of constant emergence. But since I am speaking here of aesthetics, the immediate question that comes to mind is naturally, what does an emergent aesthetic look like? In some of the examples brought to bear in this lecture series thus far, particularly in the case of Chicks on Speed, Lady Bitch Ray, and Pussy Riot, the commonality would be a DIY or do-it-yourself aspect to the visual field, indebted to the Riot Grrrl and queercore movements of the 1990s. But different than its forebears, the emergent aesthetic of DIY feminist activism transfers its material culture, still heavily dependent on the body, through digital means. Berlant hesitantly postulates that DIY cultures of activism may possibly become the noise of new politics, even as she sees much social media-generated activism to perpetuate older models of politics based in citizenship. Clicking like, sharing a link, for example. But when those DIY cultures that might be that noise of new politics rely heavily on the digital, and as we saw in Maria's lecture, not only for dissemination, but also for material creation, this is much more complicated. Not the least because the location of the political is constantly slipping from view, as these are fleeting, on the move, and changeable in digital communities. Citizenship is itself also fleeting. It is this changeability of the digital and our changing sense of belonging within that digital world that makes accessing the political impulse of the moment so difficult. Awkwardness links these DIY digital impulses to the viewer, as well as connects the variety of digital objects together. The temporal metric of emergence as one dimension of these aesthetics gets its legs from affect, again understood as not synonymously with emotion as some scholars do, but rather as relationality forged through corporeal or emotional means, directly connected to technology. The present, as discussed above, is not only the space for development of emergent aesthetics, but it is also, as Berlant goes on to argue, quote, perceived effectively. The present is what makes itself present to us before it becomes anything else. And further, the present is, quote, a thing that is sensed and under constant revision, coming through in how we individually and collectively filter situations and events. Perhaps the term awkward is so appropriate because, like its appearance in the examples of pop-feminist protest performance art by Chicks on Speed and Lady Bitch Ray, it is a word that itself is slippery. It has multiple emotional charges, something that we discovered while attempting to talk about this project in German. There is no good translation, including embarrassment, strangeness, discomfort, breakage, humor, mistakes. Further, it suggests both a relation to a public, but also to oneself, in that it causes us to feel self-conscious while on display. It is this collision between emotional slipperiness and the too much of relationality that describes the effective charge of these aesthetics. But affects are, as feminist and queer studies has shown us for the last decade, also highly political. Ben Anderson writes that, quote, affects are an inescapable element within an expanded definition of the political. And for this reason, affect, quote, provides a way of understanding and engaging with a set of broader changes in societal reproduction in the context of mutations in capitalism. This returns us to feminism and the neoliberal present. Anderson lists these changes as new forms of labor, biopolitical networks of discipline, and digital developments. Awkwardness is a negative in the sense of critical emotion that, to crib from Halberstam, pokes holes in the toxic positivity or the relations of cruel optimism of an individualized, hedonistic, and neoliberal feminism and pop consumer culture. It therefore should not be understood as a manner in which to shy away from, but rather to engage with, forge relations with, the circularity that comes out of the mutations of capitalism. But of course, as my colleagues have also noted, and as Pina's talk will also display, this political understanding is not reserved for the local context of activism. A number of scholars, such as Anne Pellegrini and Jasper Puar or Patricia Clow, have repeatedly highlighted the importance of understanding affect as a, quote, new configuration of bodies, technology, and matter, so Clow, and as the result of, but also creates the transnational domain. Technology not only reconfigures bodily capacities, it also demands we rethink and move beyond the representation of these capacities. Thinking of aesthetics in response to the increasing technological dimension of activism and its transnational reach opens us to expansive, unlimited, and self-reproducing relations in the collision of the digital with the corporeal. Puar uses the concept of virality to address transmission to multiple contexts, a concept that further links digital circulation to the biological workings of the body. Virality simultaneously suggests, quote, speed and reach of information transit, especially in relation to the internet, as well as, quote, bodily contamination, uncontainability, unwelcome transgression of border and boundaries. This viral moment disengages, in turn, transnationalism from conceptions of nationhood and muddies the distinction between local and global, routing location instead through embodiment. And I think this was really well displayed in some of the case studies we've already talked about, especially in the case of Pussy Riot, where the viral moment, the viral transmission of the Pussy Riot videos and songs and imagery was routed through digital embodiment. I would like to close this section with an example that illustrates the viral dissemination of contemporary feminist activism's imagery through digital but also material corporeal means. It further displays how process-based aesthetics of awkwardness, identified above as related to the present and affective relations, links up with and disrupts the popular sphere. In May 2013, the traveling exhibit Barbie Dreamhouse, masterminded by event marketing service Entertainment for Mattel, kicked off its European tour in Berlin, only steps from Alexanderplatz. Barbie Dreamhouse is a theme park of sorts, complete with a pink kitchen, pink display cases, and pink wardrobes, offering children, girls, experiences, from trying on Barbie's clothing and makeup to baking virtual cupcakes. Its 27,000 square foot plastic and pink appearance in the middle of East Berlin vied for attention with gray socialist-era high-rises. It thus aggressively positions its presentation of the neoliberal, capitalist, Western, read US, commodification of the female body as individual self-discovery within soaring unemployment and rising social welfare costs following unification and the Eurozone crisis. Barbie Dreamhouse was met with immediate and ongoing protest, primarily from three groups: the anti-sexist group Pink Sticks, a branch of Occupy, and representatives from Femen. The protests of the latter group produced discomfort. Femen activists appeared brandishing a Barbie on a cross, which they subsequently burned while sporting the words, "Life in plastic is not fantastic," on their bare breasts and their signature Ukrainian wreath on their heads. The naked body of the woman and the burning body of the plastic doll that has come for so many to symbolize the capitalist proliferation of sexist messages to young girls is directly related here to the blonde and naked body of the female on fire with wild emotions of her protests. Here we see aesthetics of awkwardness produced in or by political feminist creativity, transnationally for competing local contexts, United States, East Germany, Ukraine. Moreover, it clearly shows the central position of the digital in form, content, circulation, and reception of feminism. Occupy Barbie Dreamhouse now has 3,000 followers on Facebook and, in collaboration with Pink Sticks, is a self-sustaining protest group against sexism in the media. The protests around the Barbie Dreamhouse and the Dreamhouse itself produced a range of awkward moments and circulations. While claiming that they do not want a life like the plastic Barbie doll, who in turn lives mainly as a nostalgic exhibition object and as digital projection, as a digital projection inside the Dreamhouse, the Femen protester, in line with Femen's common presentation, looked somewhat like a Barbie doll. Naked blonde protester who, through writing on her body, created an analogy between herself and the plastic doll, displays eerie self-aggression and self-destruction when she burns the naked body of a look-alike doll on a cross. This tension is, of course, intentional, but it produces a range of political responses. On one level, the protester identifies with Barbie and is identified with her. On another level, she aggressively burns the Barbie in an act of sacrifice that simultaneously has blasphemic undertones, particularly in the use of religious symbolism as part of patriarchal oppression. By burning the Barbie doll on a cross, however, the protester aligns herself with what she critiques as a sexist toy fantasy, and protests by making a range of messy references to Christianity. It is only because of an assumed knowledge of the history and form of female protests and the combination of this action with the Dreamhouse exhibit, and even in anticipation of the arrest of the protester, that the act is legible as feminist. It is in the interchange between these acts, the exhibit itself, the appearance and disappearance of the exhibit and the protests, meaning in the circulations of and in between forms, that we see political moments emerge. The Barbie Dreamhouse in Berlin is an important example in the context of our argument because it so clearly illustrates that certain commercial forms, like the Barbie Dreamhouse, work together with pop-feminist movements like Femen, in ways that are certainly not intentional, but clearly politically awkward. Mattel and the Barbie franchise might, in fact, have benefited from the publicity and protests in front of the Barbie Dreamhouse experience in Berlin, might have benefited from the publicity the protests in front of the Barbie Dreamhouse experience in Berlin might have given the exhibit. Further, pop feminist activisms against the exhibit and associated protests certainly rely on the very existence of the commercial cultures that deconstruct to be politically productive. This means that we are not really talking about one event or a specific moment of feminism, but of a process and of narratives that consistently slip into new interpretive contexts. When it comes to such feminist protest cultures, digital spaces are not only spaces of convergence, but also of divergence. The digital space, as it interacts with other spaces, is a transnational space, a space in motion, a space in question. While we might often assume that digital disseminations increase visibility, some of our examples show that in the digital realm, events appear and disappear, create hypervisibilities as well as different forms of disguise. They expand and contract. This example highlights the fact that the story of new forms of appropriations, digital activism, and defiant disruption in the neoliberal context is a complicated one, where specific national contexts and geographic movements, material cultures, and its digital projections, normative body politics and its subversions, and financial interests and political activisms collide in awkward ways. We take joy in playfully approaching the pink plastic digital world as it is constructed and as it circulates as an experience. Aesthetic, therefore, references awkward feminist activism's ability to circulate, move, and transition across numerous boundaries, while also remaining slippery for the effective labor of critical agency. Thus, aesthetic defines also feminism's global reach and the manner in which local moments, including intimacy and corporeality, define their own ontology. In this final section, which forms a somewhat lengthier conclusion to our two talks, we hazard some suggestions as to where this understanding of awkwardness might take us as researchers politically. In a March 2014 talk at the University of Alberta, Donna Haraway called for listeners to, quote, stay with the trouble. Trouble in her talk and work referring specifically to a damaged and dying planet. Staying with the trouble, according to Haraway, offers a way to push back against cynicism, despair, avoidance, and denial in order to engage with the destruction we inherit in practicing joy and embracing pleasure, collectively and individually. Maria and I, too, put out a call to stay with the trouble. However, for us, trouble refers to the troublesome positions and perspective feminist politics take in popular culture, and to the difficulty feminists seem to have in working through this trouble. By staying with the trouble, in these two talks and in our research together to date, we argue with Haraway that if we understand our position as politically engaged, we can neither avoid nor deny the trouble by retreating into cynicism. But we also cannot attempt to solve or work through the trouble. The assertion that this is trouble becomes the starting point for political engagement. The joyful aspect of this trouble is that every act bears the responsibility of locating the actor in a political playing field where feminism is defined. In such a situation, either norms are confirmed or new possibilities of doing and undoing feminism evolve. The examples of Femen or Muslima pride in the previous lectures speak to this. While both groups attempt to address questions of female oppression in the political context of religion and misogyny or racism and exclusion respectively, they write these questions onto the female body, naked or veiled, and target each other, which in the public eye may reduce their political struggle to an entertaining catfight between two marginal feminist groups. What slips out of sight are their feminist political interventions beyond the media spectacle and post-feminist assertions. The trouble we find ourselves in is being faced with the necessity to do feminist politics in the face of its impossibility. The trouble, in short, is circularity of thought that consistently undoes any measurement of productivity. This circularity, however, we have suggested in these two talks, is exactly where we must begin and with which we must stay. Awkwardness is a way to use the circularity, to use the trouble, without attempting to get out of it or explain it away. It is inherent to and simultaneously intentional and unintentional in much of what we describe as examples. This circularity and attendant awkwardness is most obvious in the crossing of activism with pop and pop feminism. Pop culture is, by definition, cruelly optimistic. As consumers of pop culture, we are constantly reminded of that which we cannot achieve. Pop culture's work is based on unfulfilled and unfulfillable desire. This desire is coded as joyful, playful, performative, and by definition popular. Because it is reflective of broad-based desires and optimisms in a community, it also reflects the elitisms, classicisms, racisms, violence, or gender imbalance of that community. Pop feminism, as understood in Germany, starts with the assumption that, due to its wide sphere of influence, including its concern with sex, body politics, and identification, pop is the perfect playing field for feminist activism, the germination of which was discussed in previous talks. Pop feminist activism produces both an excess of meaning through an excess of awkwardness. Awkwardness, which we argue is politically legible and productive, especially in terms of affect and critical agency. If we think of our term awkwardness in this manner, then awkwardness also describes us as researchers. Awkwardness is a method of reading and analyzing, that is, of doing political feminist work. To choose to read awkwardly and to make things awkward, our final thought here is that feminist academics must understand, not merely make but understand all, their work as politically meaningful, and as politically feminist, and to be theoretical and interventionist, not in spite of, but in the face of the sticky mess that defines the sphere of feminist political influence in the 21st century. We pose this challenge in light of Berlant's argument in the final chapter of Cruel Optimism. She ends her chapter on politics as cruel by describing the current political moment as one of transition, perhaps even adolescent, a transition that we want to make productive for feminist politics. This transitory moment is the reason for the political bind we are in, but it also challenges us to make this precise moment productive. Berlant suggests that the models of anarchist DIY performances aim to revitalize political action, quote, not first by mapping out the better good life, but by valuing political action as the action of not being worn out by politics. This new politics sees, quote, messes as ordinary, vitalizing, interesting, absorbing, personal, and curious. And such new political forms are, quote, in the middle of detaching from the fantasy of the good life, and aim to produce some better ways of mediating the sense of the historical moment, so that it would be possible to imagine a potentialized present that does not reproduce all the conventional collateral damage. Awkwardness highlights precisely those processes of collision that we see happening across feminist activist work in the digital sphere. It is a mode of challenging our scholarship about such activism to itself also create new political forms. The call to be awkward, to address awkwardness, and to collect awkward moments is essentially a call to be self-aware researchers, writers, teachers, and administrators, and as feminists. This self-awareness must be slightly uncomfortable, stick out, and be a bit ugly, thereby pointing toward and remaining within the trouble of circular politics. Not as a mode of authority or a new ism, but instead as a strategy for building a collaborative and intimate public approach to the mainstays of power found throughout the language of our discipline, a model that itself might be described as DIY performance. Awkwardness, then, does not describe private politics that were the hallmark of earlier feminist and queer movements, but instead the radical publicness of our work and the manner in which all forms of public spaces in the academy, whether these are virtual, written, classroom, community, administrative, or conference spaces, are also intimate spaces, and therefore consciously and unconsciously involved in the project of making, doing, and undoing critical subjectivities, including our own. For feminist academics, staying with the trouble invokes what we might see as an awkward answer to what are feminist ethics today, perhaps even to be understood as an awkward ethos. Much like the awkward forms described above, an awkward ethos offers us not only a manner of describing the feminist academy, but also the form and trajectory that our ethical positionality vis-a-vis that academy must take. To emphasize awkwardness means to emphasize the process and to deny ironic distancing. But it works politically only when it is understood as an ethical position that implies self-reflexive, engaged involvement, compassion, solidarity, and connection. Again, this awkwardness neither signifies failure nor implies success. Instead, it demands a self-reflection and a multivectorial process-based approach. The circularity we began with in our description of pop feminism, activism, and digital cultures at the outset of this second lecture brought us therefore full circle to the academy. What we have hoped to show with Chicks on Speed, Lady Betray, Barbie Dreamhouse, and others is the messy and murky circulations of pop feminist activism is that without a clear goal, protest events manage to constantly slip in and out of sight without losing their political currency, maybe by constantly shifting their political target. One could also argue, of course, that for that precise reason, these protest events are not actually working, and we might agree, but add yet. They certainly seem to continue to look for ways in which they might work. The task, then, is to create a space where we can play through scenarios, theories, and pedagogies of awkwardness, and have fun doing it. We cannot stay with the trouble without the practice of joy. Quote, the practices of joyful collective and individual pleasure are essential to the art of living on a damaged planet. So Haraway. If part of that damage, as our two lectures have hopefully shown, is the neoliberal cruel optimism that is rampant throughout the above spheres of influence, then we need to find forms of making, doing, thinking, along with Haraway, together that harness the joy in the awkward. The trouble is worth it.